So today we're really talking about something that every lab deals with, how work actually gets done day to day, or these workflows that we're talking about, and why that really starts to break as labs grow. I'm Hannah Brackey. I'm the VP of product here at LabKey. Prior to working at LabKey, I was a bench scientist and worked in a variety of different labs, all with similar sort of workflow challenges that we deal with today. And I'm excited to kind of share my experience in both working in the lab, but then also with scientists over the years that we have been working with customers at LabKey. So, at a very high level, every lab has these workflows or day to day processes, and fewer really have systems to manage them. And so, most operational issues kind of stem from that gap of the fact that people have these workflows in the lab, but don't have formalized systems to help manage them. And so today I really want to talk about what that gap is and how it is showing up in the lab and really talk about where are things breaking, why they're breaking, and then what actually changes in labs that are scaling and end up sort of reducing this gap. So we'll start out with a poll and really curious to hear kind of from your guys' perspective how you describe your current lab's workflow management. And is this sort of mostly manual spreadsheets and tribal knowledge? Let's see if I can get the poll to start here. There we go. Is it partially digitized but disconnected? Is it centralized but rigid and hard to adapt? Or is it flexible, structured, and connected end to end? And keep in mind that you may have multiple of these in your lab, depending on sort of what the workflow is and where you are. So it's possible to have more than one, but curious kind of where most people are. Perfect. So it looks like most of us are kind of in those top two questions, having mostly manual or partially digitized systems, which is very, very common, and frankly, kind of where I spent most of my laboratory experience as well. So we'll come back to these answers later in the talk, but just wanted to get kind of a sense of where everyone was at today. So, what we've seen across a lot of labs is that these workflow issues aren't random. They tend to bucket into a few consistent patterns. And so, once you start to recognize these, you can recognize them in all sorts of different places within your lab. But then, most importantly, you're able to identify how to fix them or what you need to be able to address them. And so, we'll go through each of these individually. The first one is process fragmentation, and it's probably the most common starting point. I feel like this is where I spent a lot of my laboratory experience, where on paper, your workflow might exist. You might have an SOP, you might have a system, people know what to do, but in practice, it lives in a lot of different places. So I'll give you a really simple example of what this could look like. A sample comes into the lab. It might get logged by the accessioning technician into a spreadsheet. They may prep notes that go into a separate ELN or even on a paper notebook. And then results are generated from an instrument. Those results might be stored in a separate system or in a separate Excel spreadsheet, and then emails them to their PI or the collaborators. And then final data is getting stored in a PowerPoint presentation or on somebody's local computer. And so all of this is sort of that workflow, right? We're collecting the sample, we're processing it, we're receiving data, and then sending that data out. But a single system is not kind of what's being used. There's a variety of different systems that are holding all of this different information of this workflow. And so then when somebody might ask, where is the sample or what is the data on the sample? You're not looking it up, you're having to reconstruct it across all of these different tools. And so you're checking that spreadsheet, maybe the ELN, maybe email or a PowerPoint to understand kind of where something might live or how the data got generated based on that sample. And so suddenly this 10-second question might become a 10-minute task, or in some cases, it might be a many hour task, depending on how easy it is to access those tools. And so this isn't really a problem with the tools being used. It's much more of a structural issue. And it's the fact that a single system isn't kind of holding that thread. So the second one here is around traceability gaps, and particularly these traceability gaps under pressure. And so this one really doesn't show up until there's an audit or a failed result or a collaborator or a publication is asking for additional information. And so the real world scenario around this is you can probably answer most of the questions that people have, where samples are and what was done and who ran it. But with these sort of pressure points that come in, now you're having to spend time again, kind of reconstructing that traceability and understanding the question at hand. And so at that point, the team really switches modes from focusing on the science to actually doing a historical evaluation on a sample or a set of samples. And so they're pulling records, they're cross-checking timestamps, validating who did what. And if that traceability is requiring that effort, it's always going to be incomplete, right? There's always going to be steps missing or pieces that might not be clear between one system and another. And the most important thing here is that it's taking away from that actual lab work and relying on the lab to be historians, essentially. So a lot of teams don't fail these audits. They're not answering these questions, but they might spend weeks either preparing for an audit or weeks answering questions that are coming from external sources. And so that's a really good indication. If you have this symptom that the chain of custody takes a long time, that might indicate you're sort of in this bottleneck for this specific workflow. And so the third one here is around rigidity. And rigidity can really drive workarounds in the lab, especially labs that have R&D or are constantly kind of making improvements to their work. And so this is really showing up as labs evolve and you start to introduce new assays, new sample types, workflow steps. And suddenly the system that you're using doesn't quite fit. And so you have two options here. You force the new process into the existing system, or you end up tracking it somewhere else. And most teams sort of pick option two. And this is what it tends to look like. You've got then sort of side spreadsheets that a few people are managing or even know about. You're not tracking things online. It's in a paper notebook somewhere, or it ends up being a temporary process. And these temporary processes, as most of you probably know, turn out as more permanent processes because the momentum to change is very, very hard once something gets started. And so this is where sort of systems start to lose adoption and things start to erode over time as these labs are evolving. And it's not because the system is bad, it's just because they can't keep up with the evolution of what's going on with the science. And so, really importantly, these three bottlenecks don't happen independently. They tend to reinforce each other. So, if you have process fragmentation, that can really drive traceability gaps. If you have rigidity, that may drive workarounds, which may have then more fragmentation. You're generating more side spreadsheets or more things that lead to fragmentation. Or if you have traceability gaps, you then have sort of increased audit pressure. You might come out of an audit and apply more rigidity that then sort of feeds in to the rest of the cycle here. And so what can happen over time is more of these controls can get added, more manual steps appear, and more systems get introduced. And this complexity tends to start compounding on one another. And so this is how a lot of labs end up with a lot more tools, but not necessarily more clarity within their laboratory. So now let's talk about the four stages of workflow maturity. And most labs are kind of moving through these stages. In my laboratory experience, I definitely worked in all four of these, and almost in progression of my laboratory experience, and that really was great to sort of build on each of these experiences and learn from them as we were defining systems and processes. So the levels one and two, having sort of ad hoc workflows or documented workflows. These early stages is where workflows tend to live in people. And so this is an example of this is I'm going to ask Lance how I run this assay, or I'm going to go check Bernie's spreadsheet here. And as the lab grows, that really tends to become a bottleneck. You're relying on individuals to enforce process or to share their tribal knowledge. What happens as those things grow, as they forget, as it evolves, it's not really getting documented or written down. The level two piece of having kind of SOPs, this is sometimes a false sense of security. And having worked in a lab where I was writing a lot of the SOPs, I've definitely fallen into this trap because SOPs are help these processes, but it's only partial. When you have documentation, the execution can still drift over time. And if you're not staying on top of these SOPs, the SOP is going to say one thing, but everyone knows kind of the real way to do it or the way that we do it now. And that can lead to that misalignment versus execution and documentation over time. And ultimately, that execution then can vary between people as the lab continues to grow and evolve. So if we look at the later stages of these workflow maturities, having sort of a digitized but disconnected system, this is where I think most growing labs are, especially now in 2026. There's tons of teams that have LIMS or ELNs or other tools in place that force this into sort of the digital space. Data tends to live sort of in these separate systems because you've adopted different tools over time for different needs. And then you're constantly having to reconcile this information, as we talked about in kind of the process fragmentation. So you've invested in these different tools, but they're not connecting with each other. And so you're still exporting to Excel to combine data or analyze results or see that full picture, prepare a presentation. And Excel really then becomes the integration layer. So it's still digitized, but it's not kind of in a singular place. And at this level four piece, having that structured and adaptive system where workflows are connected between one step and another, that traceability is automatic and it's built into the system, and that system can adapt as the science changes, is really where we want to be overall. But the fallacy here is that, especially today, the biggest gap is not from manual to digital. Most of us are already in this digital phase. It's going from this digitized to connected space that's the hardest sort of bridge to gap to bridge at this stage. So now I wanted to kind of look back at our poll results. So let me share those, and really kind of hearing again sort of where your lab sits right now. So if we look at sort of where people said within the poll is that they're sort of in this mostly manual spreadsheets and tribal knowledge stage, or in this partially digitized stage. We have somebody at the end of sort of flexible, structured, and connected end to end, which is really great to hear. And so this is more of a reflection moment, right? Thinking about kind of what you answered here, what other people might have answered. What is the level of the workflow maturity that you feel closest to? And most importantly, starting to think about what would need to change in your lab to be able to move up one level. How do we help the folks that are in this mostly manual phase from going to a partially digitized workflow, or that partially digitized workflow up to a more centralized system? So I think it's good to just kind of think about that as sort of the takeaway of this webinar. So as we start to think about that, there's really patterns that I've experienced and I've seen in labs that sort of have been able to successfully scale. And so we're categorizing these as sort of four principles of workflow management. And the first principle is that the system really must follow the science. So if you have a system that supports how your lab works and not the other way around, this is kind of what I mean. So as an example here, if you introduce a new assay type, in some systems, you might need to wait for configuration. You might have to request IT changes, which may take many days or many months, depending on what organization you're at. Or, so the worst case scenario, you end up tracking it outside the system because it's not able to track this new assay for you. And so what ends up happening is the team just creates a spreadsheet. And with that spreadsheet now, your system of record ends up being incomplete because it exists sort of outside of that system. And so if your system can't adapt to the science tends to adapt around the system. And that really means sort of going out and using other tools that work, because ultimately, the science is the core work that we're trying to accomplish in the lab. The second principle here is around traceability and how that must be a byproduct of the system. So it should automatically happen as work gets done, not be a manual process later that people have to piece together. And so a good sort of example of this is going back to that audit scenario. An auditor may ask, show the full history of the sample, which includes who handled it, what steps were performed, what results might have been generated, what decisions might have been made. In weaker systems, you end up having to gather logs and check across different systems and validate these timestamps and indicate, who may have done what. But in stronger systems that are built for this traceability is already built in. It's already there because every action was already captured in the context. And so rather than having to piece it together, you're just sort of providing the record in the system. And so if traceability depends on effort, it's really not going to hold up under pressure of these audits or external requests or things like that. And so good to think about, tools that are building that traceability in automatically. And then the third principle we have is around how workflow management must be scientist owned. To me, this is so near and dear to my heart because I ended up getting a higher level degree so that I could manage our own workflows within our lab, because it was so difficult to manage the digital systems without more experience in database management or programming or things like that. And so the people that are doing the work really should be able to evolve the workflow as needed without the necessary, programmatic or computer science experience. And so a good example of this is you might have a really small workflow change. You might want to add a step or change a field or update a review checkpoint. And if you have a really rigid system, you're either submitting a ticket for somebody else to do that. You might be waiting for days or weeks for that update to happen. And then, of course, we're implementing that workaround in the meantime, because the science is going to keep going regardless if you have this workflow change built into the system or not. And so in flexible settings, the lab can update it directly. We added a new workflow step. Let's go in and make sure that gets aligned in our digital system. And so if these workflows can't evolve quickly, the system tends to lag behind the lab, which is really then not the system of record. So the last principle here is around data structure. And this one tends to show up much later because it's all about analysis and that long-term impact. So I used to work on clinical trial studies, and so it was really important for us to collect data correctly up front so we could do the analysis quickly many years later. And so if you have kind of reporting examples where you might want to answer, how did this assay perform over time, or what trends are we seeing? If your data is structured, you can easily query it and figure that out. If it's unstructured, it's going to require that manual effort to piece together and to do. And anytime you have manual effort in an analysis, you're going to get some biases that are introduced by the person conducting the analysis. And so the key takeaway here is that if you structure that data as early as possible, the more you can do with it later. And we work with a ton of teams that are, in the early phases of this, or didn't get the opportunity to structure it in at the outset. And so now they're sort of going back and trying to reconstruct, which is completely fine and sort of better late than never, in my opinion. Okay, so the summary here, is that all four of these, the pattern ends up being the same. If the system isn't supporting how the work is actually happening, teams tend to fill the gaps themselves. And so this isn't about having more tools, it's about whether your workflows are connected, traceable, and adaptable. And if they're not, this is where sort of those gaps tend to occur. So one of the things that we'll do sort of after this webinar is send a quick 5-question survey around sort of a diagnostic that you can use with the team to see, where are we in this process and what might we need to change to get to sort of this higher level of workflow maturity. And so I'll just end here around LabKey and the LabKey LIMS that we offer. We really have designed our systems to be configurable workflows that are managed by lab teams. So no code setup of workflow that can evolve and adapt with your science. That traceability captured is already there within the system. And so it's built in as you're executing the work within the workflow that you won't have to go back and piece that together over time. It also has a very structured, adaptable data model. So we structure the data in places that we need to make it easier for querying and analysis later, but it also is very adaptable. So as you add new steps or new assays, you're able to make those changes quickly yourselves. And then lastly, we're really AI ready and enabled via MCP. So this allows teams, as they're moving into this higher stage of digital maturity and wanting to do deeper analyses or less coded analyses, it's a tool that can help provide that as well. So after this webinar, we'll send a link to our tour of LabKey LIMS if you're interested, and you can take a look at what LabKey has to offer as sort of one example of tools that work. So I'll pause here for any questions that folks may have. Yeah, I think a good question here is sort of what is the hardest bottleneck to overcome? And we'll go back to kind of the bottlenecks so we can look at these. But I think that it really depends on the lab and the organization. But a big one for me is sort of this rigidity, because once you have established rigidity, it's really, really hard to move out of. Typically, that means that you have bespoke, homegrown systems that sort of have a specific workflow, to move out of those, in my experience, is really sort of the biggest problem. If you have fragmentation, it's easy to move to tools or centralize tools together. It's a little bit easier to identify traceability gaps if you're able to do that. But that rigidity piece, I think, is tends to be a lot higher level in terms of the decisions that need to be made, and potential options that have to be purchased. Yeah, and another question, how can you know if your workflow is not working? I think this is a really great question, and kind of reminds me of the traceability gaps that end up showing up over pressure. So certainly if you get this sort of external pressure applied to your lab, that might be a really good learning experience to understand if you've been able to identify that. But otherwise, without that external pressure, what I might do is conduct an internal audit. And we used to do this all the time in the clinical lab that I worked in. Is we would conduct an audit to say, okay, what are the SOPs that we have in place? What are the tools? If somebody came to ask me, where the sample has been, or what's the full history of the sample, what does that look like? And then as a team, going through and identifying, okay, that piece took us way too long, or we actually have a gap here that we don't know, when this got frozen between the time that it was collected. And so doing those internal audits are a good way to kind of uh, add that extra pressure onto the system. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to talk about this more, or talk to you about LabKey if you're interested. Thank you so much.